For a long time, long before pyramids rose, long before kings carved their names into stone, long before the world imagined the Maya as a civilization of calendars, stars, and gods, there was only silence, and forest, and shadows, a world untouched, a world unknown, a world waiting, denser jungles that breathed like living creatures, swamps that swallowed footprints whole, hills of limestone, so ancient that even time seemed afraid to climb them. And into this world, this wet, green, pulsing cradle of creation, came small human figures, moving like whispers between the trees. Not kings, not priests, not astronomers, only wanderers, hunter-gatherers, following the slow heartbeat of the earth. They left no cities, no monuments, no written words, only tools, only flakes of obsidian, sharp enough to peel skin from bark and hope from bone, only traces, the kind the forest would erase within moments. And yet, this is where everything began. It is almost unbelievable, standing in the ruins of later Maya cities, where towers touch the sky, where mathematics and astronomy dance together like gods, to imagine that it all began here, with 20 people, maybe 30, huddled around fires that barely pushed back the dark. But beginnings are always smaller than the destinies they hold. And this beginning, this flicker of life in the Peten Basin, was fragile. The jungles were unforgiving, the soil deceptive, the water seasonal, the land full of secrets that would drown the unprepared. The first Maya did not simply live. They survived. Every sunrise was a negotiation, every meal a victory, every tool a promise that tomorrow they might still exist. But existence was not enough, not for them, not for what they would become, because somewhere in the quiet between raindrops and the rustle of leaves, these early wanderers began to imagine a different world, a world not hunted, a world not chased, a world they could shape with their own hands. But they needed something first, something the forest did not freely give, something that would change everything, a seed, not a symbol, not a metaphor, a real seed, wild, small, stubborn, hidden in the grasslands of ancient Mesoamerica. Teosinte, the ancestor of maize, a plant so unassuming that no one at all, could have guessed. It would become the foundation of an entire civilization. At first, it was barely worth harvesting, hard kernels, few, unreliable, but the Maya saw something in it, something others did not, a potential so enormous that it felt like destiny. And destiny is patient. Generation after generation, they nurtured it, changed it, guided it, coaxed it into something new. Maize, corn, golden life, a plant that grew where others died, a plant that promised not just survival, but abundance. And abundance is the spark of civilization. With maize, the Maya no longer needed to wander endlessly. They could stop, build, stay, dream. Villages formed like constellations around fertile soil, hearths burned in the same place. Year after year, ceramics appeared, simple at first, plain bowls with rounded sides. Not art, not yet, but purpose, but permanence. The forest watched and waited, because something extraordinary was happening, something that would reshape all of Mesoamerica, a transformation, slow, silent, but unstoppable. The earth was beginning to hold memory, human memory, the kind that burrows deep into soil and stone and refuses to leave. Archaeologists today dig through the layers of those early villages, hearths, postholes, fragments, so small, so unimpressive, that most civilizations would be ashamed to claim them. But the Maya were never a people who feared humble beginnings. This shift from wandering to staying was the first crack in the world's old shell, the first breath of something vast, something powerful, something ancient. A civilization was stirring, not born yet, but waking, and in the quiet places of the forest, where shadows pool like ink at the roots of trees, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of rain, you can almost feel it, even now. The hum, the whisper, the beginning. It feels impossible that such greatness grew from such smallness, that a people who once walked barefoot through mud would one day build observatories more precise than anything else. In the ancient world, that hunters who carved bone hooks for fish would one day carve stories into stone that outlasted empires, that gatherers who searched each day for berries and roots would one day calculate the movement of Venus with mathematical accuracy that astonishes modern science. But history does not ask permission to begin. It simply begins, quietly, softly, in places no one is looking. And here, in this cradle of forests and rivers, the Maya began their long ascent, one seed at a time, one fire at a time, one breath at a time, because sometimes the greatest civilizations do not rise in triumph. They rise in hunger, in desperation, in longing, in the silent wish for something more. And the forest, ever patient, ever watchful, opened its arms and let them rise. This is where the story starts. Not with kings, not with pyramids, not with calendars carved into stone, but with people so invisible that history almost lost them. Almost, but not quite. Because you found them again, here, tonight, in the quiet, before sleep, and if you follow their story to the end, through the forests and the stars and the rise of kingdoms and the fall of worlds, you will see something most people never see. Not the greatness of a civilization, but the miracle of its becoming. And that is where the journey takes us next. Before we continue, if this story stirs something in you, a spark of wonder, a curiosity that refuses to rest, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this, more history woven into quiet nights, more journeys into worlds long forgotten, but never truly gone. Now, when you're ready, we'll step deeper into the dawn of the Maya world. And now, as the night settles deeper and the world outside your window grows quiet, let us sink further still into the beginning. Because the first Maya, those wandering souls who moved like shadows through ancient rainforests, were not merely learning the land, they were listening to it. Every rustle, every shift of wind, every animal cry, echoing through the dark. The forest was their first teacher, stern, wild, unyielding. It punished mistakes without mercy. It rewarded knowledge with life. And little by little, step by step, their understanding grew. They learned which roots healed and which killed, which insects nourished and which stung, which stones fractured clean into blades sharp enough to cut silence itself. They learned the rhythm of the seasons, the pulse of the rains, the language of bird calls and jaguar tracks and river currents. To survive in such a world was not simple endurance. It was apprenticeship, a long initiation into the deepest patterns of the earth. And perhaps that silent, reverent learning is why the Maya would one day understand the stars better than almost anyone else on the ancient earth. Because to read the sky, you must first learn to read the world beneath it. And they did, for generations. But even knowledge was not enough. Not yet. Because a scattered band is not a people, and a people is not a civilization. Something was missing, something more powerful than obsidian or fire or shelter. A reason to gather, a reason to stay. And slowly, softly, almost imperceptibly, that reason arrived. It did not thunder, it did not shout, it did not demand. It rooted. Maize did more than feed them. It anchored them. It told them that the world could be renewed in the same place, again and again and again. No more chasing herds, no more wandering between hunger and hope. Now, the land itself was a companion, a partner, a promise. And from that promise, villages began to form. They were not grand, not yet. Clusters of homes with walls of woven branches and roofs of thatch, floors of packed earth, hearths glowing gently into the night. Fires pulsed through the darkness, tiny islands of warmth in a sea of forest. Children slept near their mothers. Men returned with game and roots. Women ground mace on stone metats that would someday become sacred objects. Slowly, the shape of life changed. Slowly, a people began to remember their place, because memory, true memory, is born only when the world around you stops shifting beneath your feet. And this new world was still fragile, still trembling, still unsteady. A single drought could fracture it. A failed harvest could scatter it. A sickness could erase it. But they stayed, and staying is the first act of civilization. And something else happened in those nights of fire and quiet breath. Stories were born, not written, not carved, not yet, but spoken, softly, carefully. Stories of animals who shaped the land, stories of spirits who guarded the rains, stories of ancestors who walked beside the living, in shadows only the heart could see. These were not myths, not then. They were explanations for thunder, for dawn, for death, for the strange patience of crops rising from the soil. And as these stories passed from elder to child, to grandchild, to the unborn, the Maya learned something profound. The world was alive, and everything in it carried meaning. A seed was not only food, it was a promise, a god, a cycle, a universe in miniature. A flame was not merely warmth, it was memory, it was continuity, it was the thread between the living and the dead. A stone was not just a stone, it was what the earth left behind to be shaped by human hands. And so, little by little, their world filled with symbols, and symbols became foundations, and foundations, one day, would become pyramids. But even in these earliest days, before cities, before writing, before ceremony, something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface. Archaeologists, digging through early settlements, have found something strange, something unexpected, something quiet, but unmistakable. Order, post holes, aligned in patterns, hearths, placed with intention, storage pits, arranged like thoughts, set into the ground. Nothing random, nothing careless, as though, even before they knew it, the Maya were beginning to think like architects, like planners, like people who would one day shape a world. Perhaps they sensed that something immense was stirring beneath them, something older than their own footsteps, something waiting to be awakened. Or perhaps they were simply listening, because the forest holds its own mathematics, its own geometry, its own way of arranging life. Stand long enough beneath a canopy of ceiba trees, and you begin to understand why ancient peoples saw the world as layered realms, connected by roots and branches. Look long enough at the spread of vines across limestone, and you begin to see how nature itself draws maps that humans later copy. Watch the moon rise and fall through the same gap in the trees, night after night, and you begin to feel the rhythm that will one day become a calendar. And so, even without cities, even without kings, even without priests, the Maya were already learning how to be Maya, already learning how to listen to the breath of nature and the heartbeat of time, already walking toward the destiny that waited for them beyond the horizon. A destiny they could not yet see, a destiny that began in obscurity and silence and smallness, a destiny that would one day rise like a temple against the sky. And you, here, tonight, breathing slowly, as sleep begins its gentle pull, are witnessing the faintest beginning of that destiny. The moment before awakening, the inhale before history exhales, the spark before the world catches fire, because the Maya story is not simply the rise of a civilization, it is the rise of intention, of memory, of identity, of humanity learning how to carve meaning out of wilderness. And you are standing at its threshold, the forest behind you, the future ahead, and the path is waiting. For a long time after the first Maya fires held their fragile glow, against the darkness, something deeper began to shift, not in the sky, not in the gods, but in the soil, because once a people learn that the earth can be persuaded to feed them, not sometimes, not by chance, but faithfully, rhythmically, predictably, everything changes. Maize was the beginning, but it was not the whole story. Not yet. The early Maya, anchored now to the land they once only crossed, began to look at the world around them with new eyes. Eyes not of wanderers, but of caretakers, builders, dreamers. And the land responded. The first villages did not rise suddenly. They gathered like dew, like mist, like small breaths, drawn in the hours before dawn, hodes clustered near streams and seasonal ponds, cooking ash, left stains that still remain 3,000 years later. Tools were buried, lost, forgotten, only to be found again by hands born millennia afterward. El Mirador, Nakbe, Quello, Holmol. Back then, they were not cities, not even towns, just beginnings. The earliest notes of a grand symphony, still centuries away. But look closely, and you can see the first threads of civilization being woven, the first fires that did not wander, the first families who returned to the same doorway year after year, the first children who grew up in the same settlement where their mothers had once gathered berries and ground maize. Continuity, stability, memory. These things transform more powerfully than any god. And so the Maya began to change. They crafted tools, not just for the day, but for seasons, for harvests, for the future. Obsidian, shaped into blades, so sharp they could split a hair. Chert, napped into drills, scrapers, perforators that hinted at crafts yet to come. But the greatest revolution after maize was something humbler, simpler, clay. The first ceramics were not beautiful. They were functional, rounded bowls, with thick walls and plain surfaces. No color, no symbols, to no elegance, but they held food, they held water, they held meaning, because pottery is the signature of a people who plan to stay. A wandering life leaves behind what it cannot carry. A settled life begins to accumulate. And in those accumulations, those fragments of bowls, buried beneath floors, those jars, shattered by time, those pieces, archaeologists brush clean with trembling hands. the Maya left behind, the quiet proof that they were beginning to imagine permanence. But permanence demands more than clay. It demands shelter that lasts, food that endures, water that stays, even when the rains to forget to fall. And so the Maya learned the land once more, not as hunters, but as farmers. They watched the patterns of the hills, where water pooled, where maize grew tallest, where trees gave just enough shade to protect tender shoots from burning sun. They studied soils with hands, with sight, with ancestral intuition, shaped by centuries of survival. And slowly their world grew, not upward like pyramids, not yet, but outward, cleared patches of forest, charcoal in the soil, footpaths connecting one family to another, villages emerging like constellations across the lowlands. And as people gathered, as they shared seeds, stories, tools, something else began to stir. Identity, not as individuals, not as families, but as a people with habits, preferences, styles, a people whose hands shaped clay in ways no other region did, a people whose tools left behind a pattern recognizable across centuries, a people who began to look outward beyond their own lives and imagine structures larger than necessity, simple platforms built from earth, small plazas cleared for gatherings, communal spaces where stories, ceremonies, decisions began to take form, and above all, fire, central fires, shared fires, fires that meant these people were no longer alone, but the land was still a teacher with hard lessons. Droughts came, floods carved through fields, hurricanes tore roofs from homes and scattered ash across soil that had barely learned to give life. Some villages collapsed, others retreated into the forest. Still others rose from the ashes and grew back stronger, as though the earth itself were choosing who would remain. But each time, each cycle of destruction and renewal, the Maya carried forward what they had learned. Adaptation became instinct. Instinct became knowledge. Knowledge became tradition. And tradition became identity. By now, the forest was no longer a place they survived. It was the place they belonged. But the forest did not simply hold them. It transformed them, because as the Maya farmed, built, learned, a slow realization began to rise. The world was not chaotic. It was patterned. The rains came in cycles. The stars moved in rhythms. The sun returned to the same point on the horizon, year after year after year. To see patterns is to seek meaning. To seek meaning is to create systems. And systems are the beginning of knowledge. The Maya were not yet astronomers, not yet mathematicians, not yet calendar keepers, but they were watching, silently, faithfully, night after night, and in their village life, their grinding stones, their storage pits, their aligned hearths, the first faint echoes of future greatness were already vibrating. Archaeologists notice it in the soil, in the angles of post holes, in the careful placements of early structures. Nothing extravagant, nothing monumental, only intention, a growing sense that life could be ordered, balanced, shaped. From this, society began to stratify, not with kings, not with nobles, not yet, but with roles, hunters who still tracked deer in the forests, farmers who tended the new lifeblood of the people, tool makers whose hands were beginning to remember techniques that would someday carve gods, potters who shaped the vessels, that shaped the meals, that shaped the families, that shaped the villages. Everyone had a place, and place, true place, is the beginning of community. But community is more than proximity. It is agreement, shared purpose, shared belief. And so, as villages grew, the Maya began to gather, not only to eat or work, but to celebrate, to mourn, to speak to the unseen forces they sensed in wind and fire and rain, small rituals, offerings, songs, the ancient seeds of a religion that would one day build temples higher than the treetops. But back then, all of it was small, so small that history almost missed it, until one day the small became many, and the many became connected, and the connected became something else entirely, the beginnings of a civilization, a quiet one, a careful one, a patient one, a civilization, not yet visible from the sky, not yet carved into stone, not yet singing with the voices of kings, but present, growing, rooting deeper with every season, because once maize took hold in the soil, the Maya took hold in the world, and the world would never be the same. You can feel it now, can't you? That subtle hum beneath everything. The feeling that something larger is awakening, something ancient stretching its limbs. For the first time, the dawn has not yet broken, but the horizon is beginning to glow. And in that glow, the next chapter waits. When you're ready, we'll step closer to the first ceremonial centers, the first platforms, the first whispers of the Olmec world, reaching into Maya lands, and the first sparks of a cultural transformation that will change everything. And so, as the light grew in the far edges of the Maya world, a new question began to form. If villages could rise from nothing, what else could humans build? The forest watched as the Maya learned to trust the land, but the land also learned to trust them. Every season left its mark. Every harvest deepened the bond between people and earth. And slowly, almost invisibly, the Maya began to reshape the landscape in ways no earlier wanderers had ever imagined. They cleared fields, not at random, but with intention, guided by an understanding of sunlight, shadow, and the quiet language of growing things. They planted, in patterns, rows, clusters, rings, discovering which shapes held water, which soils kept warmth, which slopes offered safety from harsh winds. The forest was no longer merely a backdrop. It became a partner. Even the trees they cut were chosen with care. Not everything was taken. Not everything was burned. For the Maya had already learned a truth only sustainable cultures know. To change the land is to owe it something. And so they planted. As often as they harvested, they balanced their needs with the forest's breath. They built a world where survival and respect were not opposites, but companions. In this balance, a deeper shift began, because once people learn to work with nature, not against it, their lives grow longer, their families grow stronger, their stories grow richer, and from those stories, culture is born. A new kind of tool appeared in their hands, one made not of stone or clay or bone, but of understanding. Knowledge became a tool. Memory became inheritance. And with inheritance came structure. Elders began teaching the young, not merely how to survive, but how to live, how to choose land, how to read clouds, how to feel the air before a storm, how to plant on the first rains and harvest before the last. These lessons were not written, not yet. They were carried in voices, in gestures, in patient guidance. By half-light, generations began to stack behind one another, like layered soil, each adding something the next would need. But as villages grew, so did complexity. People who once moved freely now lived close, close enough to share joy and close enough to share conflict. Yet even conflict became a teacher. Arguments taught boundaries. Competition taught innovation. Jealousy taught leadership. Cooperation taught community. And within this mix of human emotions and human needs, the early Maya began to experiment with something revolutionary. Organization, not kingship, not monarchy, not yet, but agreement. Shared fire pits for shared meals, shared fields when a family struggled, shared rituals to calm fears when droughts lingered too long or storms struck too hard. Human lives were beginning to weave together into something greater than survival, a society still fragile, still forming, still learning how to stand, but unmistakably on the rise. And the land responded in kind. Waterways became lifelines, footpaths became roots, roots became networks, networks became the first threads of trade. A pot moved from one village to another. A stone blade changed hands. A shell, polished by distant waves, found its way into a hut hundreds of miles inland. Every exchange carried more than an object. It carried possibility, because trade is curiosity made practical. It is the belief that what lies beyond the forest matters. The Maya were beginning to look outward, toward distant hills, toward new neighbors, toward new ideas, arriving slowly from the Gulf Coast, ideas that bore the unmistakable scent of the Olmec world. Strange figures, carved in stone, masks with feline features, symbols not yet understood, but deeply compelling. Even before the Maya built pyramids, they felt the pull of something larger than themselves. They did not yet know what form it would take, but the land knew, and time knew, and history, waiting patiently in the shadows, knew, because by now the Maya were doing something rare. They were staying, committing, returning to the same soil year after year. And when people stay long enough, deep enough, the land begins to shape their identity as much as they shape it. Certain patterns became universal. Homes aligned in similar ways. Tools carved with familiar shapes. Pottery showing consistent styles across distant regions. This was no longer life too, a collection of isolated groups. It was becoming a culture, a singular voice, formed from thousands, a new presence in Mesoamerica, quiet but rising. And though the world did not yet see it, though the treetops hid the growth, from any distant eye, a civilization was taking root, a civilization that would one day stretch across jungles, mountains, coasts, and time itself, a civilization that would calculate the heavens with a precision that would astonish the modern world, a civilization that would build cities so magnificent that even when abandoned, their ruins would echo with grandeur. But here, in these early villages, none of that existed yet. Only the seeds. Seeds in the soil, seeds in the mind, seeds in the heart, and seeds, when tended carefully, become forests. Forests become worlds, and worlds become civilizations. The Maya were learning not only how to live, but how to become. From this moment onward, their story would no longer be small. It would stretch into centuries, into realms of gods and kings, into temples that pierced the sky, and calendars that mapped the cosmos. But before the stone rose, before the kings ruled, before the gods spoke, there was this: villages, clay, maize, memory, the quiet dawn before the first sun of the Maya world truly rose. For a long time, villages whispered beneath the forests, soft, fragile, still learning how to stand. But then something shifted, not in the soil, not in the seeds, but in the minds of the Maya. A new thought, so simple, so powerful, began to stir. What if we build something that lasts longer than us? It was a quiet question, but quiet things can be the beginning of revolutions. And in the centuries that followed, those quiet villages did something unimaginable. They rose, not all at once, not in sudden glory, but with patience, the same patience they had learned from the earth itself. The forest watched as people gathered in larger numbers. Families became clans. Clans became communities. Communities became centers. And the centers, still humble, still modest, began to change the land. Raise platforms of packed earth, low mounds aligned with the sun, spaces cleared intentionally, carefully, ritually. These were not yet the pyramids we imagine today. They were beginnings, foundations, the first lines sketched on the canvas of Maya civilization. At places like Nakbay, El Mirador, San Bartolo, the forest began to bend around new shapes. Earth lifted, paths connected, people converged. For the first time, the Maya were building for reasons beyond shelter, beyond hunger, beyond daily life. They were building for the sky, because the moment you raise a platform toward the heavens, you declare that the world is not just a place to live, but a place to understand. From these raised platforms, the Maya watched the horizon with new eyes. They saw that the sun did not wander randomly. It returned to the same rising points. Year after year, they saw that Venus moved in cycles, bright, vanishing, bright again. They saw that the moon carved patterns in the night, as precise as breathing, and suddenly the sky was no longer mystery. It was a map, a clock, a teacher, a god. And so, these early ceremonial centers were not just architecture, they were instruments, observatories, in the simplest form, mounds that lifted the human gaze just high enough to see the world differently. Imagine Amaya Elder standing atop a low earthen platform, watching the sun rise perfectly between two hills. Imagine her whispering the discovery to her children. Imagine those children lighting fires every time the sky repeated its rhythm. Imagine a memory slowly forming, one that would one day become a calendar of astonishing accuracy. But knowledge never rises alone. Where understanding grows, belief follows. Where belief settles, ritual begins. And where ritual gathers, a center is born. People travelled from surrounding villages to these new places of earth and sky. They brought offerings, maize, cacao, shells, jade flakes, the first hints of a world already reaching outward toward the distant coasts. They danced, they prayed, they shared stories shaped by starlight and firelight. Slowly, ceremonial life became the heartbeat of these early centers. But there was more, much more, because in those same centuries, far to the west, another world was rising, a world of colossal stone heads, jaguar-faced deities, and symbols, unlike anything the Maya had yet imagined. The Olmec, a civilization older, stranger, more enigmatic than any neighbor the Maya had known. And the Olmec were not quiet. Their influence moved through rivers and trade routes, like a shadow with substance. Jade from the Motagua Valley carried west. Obsidian from highland Guatemala carried east. Ideas from the Gulf Coast carried everywhere. When Olmec traders entered Maya lands, they brought more than goods. They brought symbols, rituals, concepts of kingship, concepts of order, concepts of divine power, flowing through rulers chosen by the gods. The Maya did not adopt everything. They were too independent for that, too rooted in their own identity. But they listened, they observed, and they learned. For the first time, a new idea entered Maya thought. Leadership might be something greater than age or wisdom. It might be sacred. This was not yet the age of kings, not yet the age of palaces and carved stone. But the seed had been planted, and seeds in Maya hands never stayed small. As Olmec influence touched Maya villages, art changed first. Simple clay figures gained new features. Faces widened. Eyes took almond shapes. Some figurines carried baby jaguar traits, a clear echo of Olmec mythologies. Pottery styles shifted. Carved motifs appeared. Symbols that once had no form began taking shape on clay, on stone, on bodies, painted for ritual. It was as though something ancient and powerful was being awakened. And with this awakening, architecture changed too. Mounds grew larger, platforms broadened, sites expanded. What was once a gathering place became a center. What was once a center became a hub. What was once a simple ceremonial mound became a complex of plazas, aligned structures, and spaces, designed not only for people but for the gods. By 1000 BCE, deep within the lowlands, you could walk through regions where dozens of villages fed into a single node of ritual life. Trade routes thickened, ceremonies synchronized, communities looked to the same hills, the same mounds, the same gatherings for meaning. A cultural network was forming, a network that no drought could break, no storm could scatter. The Maya were no longer a scattered people. They were becoming a connected one. And connection is the root of civilization. All of it. The clay, the maize, the fires, the platforms, the Olmec influence led to a moment that changed everything. A moment when the Maya looked at the land and realized we can build more, we can build bigger, we can build forever. The age of ceremonial centers had begun, and soon those centers would rise so high that they would pierce the canopy of the jungle and touch the edge of the heavens. And yet, even as these early centers lifted themselves from the forest floor, a quiet truth began to crystallize. The Maya were no longer learning how to build. They were learning why to build. Because a structure is never just a structure, not when a civilization is awakening. It is an intention, a declaration, a conversation with the cosmos. And the Maya, ever patient, ever observant, were beginning to answer the sky with earth. From every village, families traveled for ceremonies that stretched for days, sometimes weeks. The centers filled with music Footsteps, chants rising, like mist. Torches glowed in long rows, along packed earth causeways. Drums echoed against the jungle canopy. Children watched, wide-eyed, as elders painted their faces in red ochre and black charcoal, colours of the dawn and the night. To the outsider's eye, it might have looked like celebration, but it was more, so much more. It was identity, forming itself. It was belief, taking shape. It was society, learning to recognize its own reflection. As these gatherings grew, a subtle hierarchy began to emerge, not in cruelty, not in dominance, but in responsibility. Some people became keepers of ritual, others keepers of fields, others keepers of knowledge. Those who remembered when the last drought came, when the floods were deepest, when the crops were strongest. The first specialists were appearing, and with specialization comes complexity, and with complexity comes the need for spaces that can hold it. No single household could contain what the Maya were becoming. The land needed markers, sacred spaces, places built not for sleeping or eating or daily life, but for meaning. And so the ceremonial centers grew again. Platforms became terraces. Terraces became courtyards. Courtyards became plazas where hundreds, sometimes thousands, could gather. Imagine them, the early Maya, standing shoulder to shoulder as the first light broke across the horizon and illuminated a carefully aligned platform built to catch that exact moment. Imagine the gasp. Imagine the awe. Imagine the feeling of unity in a world whose mysteries were beginning to yield their secrets. These were not accidents. They were designs, intentional, precise, because the Maya were not merely builders. They were observers, scholars without books, astronomers without telescopes, engineers without metal. The forest was their classroom, the sky their scripture. They built not to impress, but to understand, and understanding builds empires. Yet even as the Maya crafted their centers from mud, clay, stone, and memory, another influence drifted into their world, subtle, powerful, inevitable. The Olmec, not as conquerors, not as rulers, but as a cultural tide. Their symbols carried weight, their gods carried presence, their art carried stories the Maya had never heard before, and one idea stood above the rest. Power can be sacred. Leadership was being reimagined. It no longer belonged only to elders or to the wise. It began to belong to those who could speak to the gods, or at least to those who could convince others that they could. You can almost see it, the first Maya ritualists, standing taller than before, their bodies painted with imported symbols, their voices echoing with new authority. They were not kings, not yet, but they were something new, the first to stand apart, the first to gather followers, the first to turn ritual into role, and roles, when repeated, become institutions. By the time El Mirador and Nakbe began their earliest expansions, the Maya were no longer simply building spaces. They were building systems, broad causeways, connected settlements across miles of jungle, white plaster paths, shining beneath the sun, visible from great distances. People could walk from one center to another without ever losing the sense that they were part of something larger. Trade intensified, objects moved, ideas moved, people moved. Everything was gathering momentum, and momentum is the heartbeat of rising civilizations. As ceremonial centers grew in size, their functions multiplied. They became places for markets where salt, obsidian, fish, and textiles changed hands. They became places for diplomacy, where one community could meet another without fear. They became places for ritual, where dancers wore jaguar pelts and priests burned copal resin, whose fragrant smoke spiraled upward like prayers unfolding in the air. Imagine the sound, the rhythmic stamping of hundreds of feet during a communal dance, the deep hum of conch shell trumpets, the sudden cry of a child seeing an eclipse for the first time held safely in her mother's arms. These moments created culture, but culture cannot remain small when its people begin to look upward, and the Maya were looking upward more than ever. They marked the zenith passage of the sun, that rare moment when shadows vanish and the world glows evenly from every side. They marked the rising of Venus as morning star, believed to signal transformation, danger, new beginnings. They marked the solstices, the equinoxes, the slow dance between earth and sky that shaped their understanding of time itself. And in that understanding, a revelation. Time has structure. The world has order. We can measure it. When a civilization begins to measure time, it begins to measure destiny. And the Maya were learning to measure both. The ceremonial centers were no longer places of gathering. They were repositories of cosmic knowledge, anchors for the cycles of sun and moon, theaters for the rhythms of creation. In these early ages, the scribes had not yet carved glyphs into stone, but the knowledge was already present, stored in memory, in ritual, in architecture, aligned perfectly with the sky. Every mound was a sentence, every platform a paragraph, every alignment a chapter in a book. The Maya were writing with soil and stars. The pre-classic landscape was beginning to transform. What were once small ritual nodes became regional powers. El Mirador, still centuries away from its greatest peak, began to swell with ambition. Nakbe grew networks that reached outward like open hands. San Bartolo nurtured early art, whose elegance would echo through 1,000 years. La Blanca, Civil, Tintal, all stirred as the Maya began to realize that ceremonial spaces could become cities, cities that would not serve just the living, but the gods, the seasons, the ancestors, the very cycles of existence. All of this, every symbol, every alignment, every influence, led to a single truth emerging slowly from the forest's breath. The Maya are no longer rising. They are preparing to ascend. The next era will not be built with clay and small mounds. It will be built with monumentality, with temples that pierce the sky, with plazas that can hold nations, with pyramids so vast they seem grown from the earth itself. For a long time, the ceremonial centers stood quietly beneath the canopy, bright with meaning, alive with ritual, but still small enough that the forest could reclaim them in a season. But then something changed. Not a moment, not a discovery, not a single brilliant idea. No, it was a pressure, a slow rising, a gathering of needs and dreams and people that could no longer fit inside the villages that birthed them. The Maya had outgrown their beginnings, and when a people outgrow their beginnings, the world around them must change. Slowly at first, then suddenly, and the change began here, in the Mirador Basin, a cradle of wetlands, ridges, and limestone plateaus that rose gently above the floods and breathed mist. Every morning, like a living being, this was the place where the Maya would attempt something no one else in the Americas had ever dared, building cities so immense that they would challenge mountains, cities whose foundations covered kilometers, cities that gathered thousands into their plazas, cities that turned the forest into architecture and the sky into a companion, and at the center of it all, a name whispered, even now, by archaeologists, as though invoking an ancient god, El Mirador, not yet a ruin, not yet a memory, in this age, alive, growing, rising, and rising in a way that defied every expectation of what humans could accomplish with stone, with earth, with simple tools and infinite patience. Imagine it, a jungle valley, thick with ceiba trees and strangler figs, and in the middle of it, a complex of pyramids, so large that even the forest could not hide them. Imagine the roar of construction, the scraping of limestone plaster, spread by hand, the human chains passing baskets of earth, upwards, 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 toward a sky that seemed to lean closer every time a new layer rose. Imagine triadic temple groups emerging from the flat earth, three structures, arranged like a constellation, mirroring patterns in the heavens. With mathematical devotion, these were not random mounds, not mere symbols. They were mirrors, reflections of cosmology, translated into architecture, because by now, the Maya had discovered something profound. A city is not only for the living, it is a map of the universe, a living diagram of creation, a statement that the world can be built according to meaning, not accident. And in these early cities, the earliest great Maya cities, meaning was everywhere, in the angles of staircases, in the orientations of temples, in the long white causeways that stretched across the basin like veins carrying breath between distant settlements, causeways, sakbub, raised stone roads, glowing white, under moonlight, leading from El Mirador to Nakbe, to Tintal, to distant centres, lost to time. These were not roads for ordinary travel. They were ceremonial arteries, processional paths, for pilgrims, traders, leaders, priests. Imagine walking them at night, the plaster cool beneath your feet, the jungle alive with sound, torches burning in long lines, so straight they seem impossible in a land of tangled trees. These roads did not simply connect cities, they connected beliefs, they connected people who had never met, but who shared the same calendar, the same rituals, the same stories of gods, born in darkness and light, carved from chaos. A civilization was forming, not through conquest, but through coherence, not through force, but through meaning, and meaning needs monuments, and monuments need scale, and scale, the kind the Maya were now imagining, requires something deeper than desire. It requires organization, division of labor, coordination of resources, leadership that begins to look like kingship even before kings are named, and in El Mirador, the first shadows of that leadership began to sharpen. Ritual specialists became administrators. Administrators became overseers. Overseers became something very close to rulers, not divine yet, not absolute, but necessary, because only necessity creates the kind of order that can move 1,000,000 cubic meters of stone and earth. Only necessity can shape a city so vast that even today, From the sky, its outlines still imprint themselves on the landscape, and yet, for all their magnitude, these cities were not built from ego. They were built from cosmology. Every pyramid was a sacred mountain, every plaza a place where heaven and earth touched briefly. In the breath of ritual, every triadic complex a recreation of the world's first dawn. El Mirador was not imitating the cosmos, it was becoming it. And Nakbe, its sister, its rival, its mirror, rose alongside it, sharing its vision, echoing its ambition. The two became twin lights, in the pre-classic world, soaring in parallel, competing gently, as cities sometimes do, each trying to build higher, wider, grander than the other. In their wake, other centres expanded. Sival, Tintal, Ladanta's towering complex, one of the largest pyramids ever built by human hands, began its ascent toward the sky. Imagine standing at the base of Ladanta in its prime, a staircase so steep it steals your breath just to look at it. Terraces layered like steps into the heavens. Walls plastered smooth and white, glowing in the sun like the bones of the earth. A monument not to power but to harmony. Harmony between earth and sky, between humans and gods, between what is visible and what is remembered. The Maya were not just building cities, they were building cosmic theatres, stages upon which the story of creation could be reenacted, season after season, century after century, and the people responded. Populations swelled, trade thickened, craft specialization flourished, artists became artisans, artisans became masters, masters became visionaries. Obsidian from the highlands, shells from distant coasts, cinnabar from the mountains, jade from sacred valleys. Materials travelled farther, ideas travelled faster. For the first time, the Maya world felt not like clusters of villages and centres, but like a region woven into unity. A unity built not by force, but by shared cosmology. And shared cosmology is stronger than any army. But even as these cities rose and shone and flourished, the world around them was changing. Forests were shrinking, water systems strained, populations stretched the land's capacity to its limit. Greatness always arrives with a cost, and the cost was coming, but not yet, not here, in the radiant heart of the pre-classic world. Here we stand at the beginning of Maya monumental grandeur, the moment when architecture became theology, when cities became universes, and when the Maya stepped fully into the identity that would define them for the next 2,000 years. And yet, even here, at the height of their early brilliance, something deeper began to pulse beneath the surface. A question, a whisper, a presence. What comes next? Because cities, this vast, this intricate, this spiritually charged, do not remain mere ceremonial centres. For long, they attract power, they invite ambition, they create paths for new kinds of leadership. And in the halls of El Mirador and Nakbe, this shift was beginning, not loudly, not violently, but quietly, in the way decisions were made, in the way rituals grew elaborate, in the way certain voices carried further than others. Those who understood the cycles of the sun began to guide planting seasons. Those who read the movements of Venus began to advise Angenies, trade, and war. Those who interpreted the breaths of the gods began to speak for the invisible. A hierarchy was rising, Still not kings. Still not dynasties. Not the ornate courts that would come later. But the scaffolding was there. You can almost see them. The early lords of these pre-classic cities, standing atop freshly plastered pyramids, watching their people gather in the plazas below. Not ruling, not commanding, but shaping, guiding, connecting the rhythm of the heavens with the rhythm of human life. And the people responded with reverence, because the one who could predict the rains held power. The one who could calm the storms held faith. The one who could stand closest to the gods held destiny. This was the dawn of a political order that would define the Maya world for centuries. A world where rulers did not rule because they conquered, but because they interpreted, because they held keys to the architecture of the cosmos. But even as leadership began to solidify, construction did not slow. It accelerated. City after city expanded outward, pushing the forest backwards, reshaping valleys, carving new plazas from the earth. El Mirador's triadic complexes multiplied. Nakbay's causeways stretched further. Tintal grew a reservoir system so large that it could survive the cruelest dry season. Water, the most fragile blessing of the lowlands, became something humans could control, and that changed everything, because when water is predictable, populations swell. When populations swell, labor multiplies. When labor multiplies, monuments rise faster and higher than ever before. This was the age when the Maya learned mastery over landscape, not through domination, but through adaptation. Terraces to hold soil, channels to guide rain, reservoirs to store life. The cities hummed with innovation, centuries ahead of their time. But these systems required management, required oversight, required minds that understood the balance between abundance and collapse. And so the first seeds of statecraft began to form. But even brilliance cannot escape the weight of its own success. As cities grew, the distance between centres and their surrounding fields widened. Farmers walked farther. Forests fell faster. Resources strained. The Maya were pushing the land to its threshold. And though the threshold would not break, for generations the strain began to hum beneath the surface. A soft warning, a breath held too long. And yet the cities rose higher. La Danta soared. El Tigre expanded. The central Acropolis spread like a stone crown across the jungle ridge. Plazas big enough for thousands began to dominate the landscape. Imagine them, sunlight falling in broad sheets across white plaster floors, so bright that they glowed like ice. Children running along embankments, priests painting glyphs on bark paper scrolls now lost to time, artisans carving stucco masks of gods with open jaws and star-filled eyes. The cities were alive, not ruins, not relics, living organisms moving with the breath of the people who built them. And in this vibrancy, a new kind of art emerged. Stucco friezes stretching across temple faces, the earliest stories told in symbols that would one day blossom into full script. Masks, the size of houses, their brows heavy, their mouths open, in eternal speech. Sculpted serpents crawling up staircases like cosmic rivers. This was not decoration. This was communication. Messages to the gods. Messages to the ancestors. Messages to the unborn. Here, in the plaster and stone of the pre-classic world, the Maya were beginning to carve identity into permanence. Writing was not yet mature, but its spirit was already alive. In these faces, these forms, these silent mouths that seem, even now, to breathe beneath the jungle light. And yet, for all their grandeur, the cities were not eternal. Nothing built by human hands ever is. Forests crept closer. Trade routes shifted. Ritual needs changed. And as the centuries turned like slow gears, the energy of this pre-classic brilliance began to wane. Not collapse, not catastrophe, not yet, but a settling, a soft exhale, a recognition that the era of colossal pre-classic cities was drawing to a close. El Mirador would one day fall silent, its pyramids swallowed by vines, its plazas filled with leaves, its causeways cracked by root and rain, but its legacy would not vanish. Its ideas, triadic architecture, causeway networks, cosmological city planning, would travel into the next age, an age where writing would flourish, where dynasties would rise, where kings would carve their names into eternity. The classic period waited ahead, a world of power, warfare, science, and flourishing art. But before we enter it, we must pause here in the last quiet breath of the pre-classic world, because this was the moment that shaped everything, the moment when architecture became scripture, when cities became cosmos, when humanity looked at the sky and said, "Let us build something worthy of the gods." For a long time, the great pre-classic cities glowed like constellations across the jungle. El Mirador, Nakbe, Tintal, Sival. Their pyramids rose like mountains, their causeways spread like rivers of stone. But even monuments cannot stand still in the flow of time. As centuries turned, something subtle began to shift in the heart of the Maya world. Not in the temples, not in the plazas, not in the stones that gleamed under the sun, but in the people, in their beliefs, in their hierarchies, in the way they understood the distance between heaven and earth. Because the more the Maya observed the sky, the more precise their measurements became, and the more precise their knowledge became, the more sacred it felt. Knowledge was not simply knowledge, it was power. And power, when wrapped in ritual, framed in myth, spoken in symbols, becomes something else. Authority. This is where a new figure began to rise from the shadows of the pre-classic world, the divine king, not a chief, not a village elder, not a ritual guide, a ruler whose blood was believed to carry the echoes of gods, a ruler whose body connected the three realms, the sky world, the earth world, and the watery underworld, where ancestors walked in eternal dusk, a ruler whose every gesture was cosmic, whose every act was sacred, whose every breath seemed to draw power from realms no ordinary human could enter. The Maya did not invent kingship in a single explosion of ideology. It did not appear overnight. It grew layer by layer, ritual by ritual, myth by myth. It grew the way stone rises into a pyramid, one deliberate block after another, and the foundations of that new order were laid in the centuries that followed. The fading of El Mirador, smaller cities rose, Tikal, Uexactum, Calakmul, Dzibonke, Quirigua, centers that would one day become giants. Each had a ruler, a holy lord, and a jaw, a word. That meant more than king, a word. That meant he who commands time, Because Maya kings did not simply rule people, they ruled the calendar, they ruled the rituals, they ruled the cosmic cycles that stitched the universe together. To follow a king was to follow the order of the cosmos, and the people believed deeply in that order, so deeply that they built monuments, not only to their gods, but to their rulers, stelae carved with profiles of kings towering above captives, glyphs recording their births, accessions, bloodletting rituals that opened portals for divine communication. Every detail of a king's life became scripture in stone, and those stones spoke loudly, louder than any voice, in the forests, louder than any priest, standing before a fire, louder than even the pyramids that touched the sky. Because writing had arrived, writing that did not simply record, writing that declared lineage, declared legitimacy, declared cosmic right. When a Maya king stood before his people and carved his name into stone, he was not simply marking history, he was shaping it, giving it form, giving it memory, giving it permanence. Names now immortal, dates now eternal, stories now bound to the very earth. This was the dawn of the classic period, the age when Maya kings began to reign, not as leaders, but as living symbols of the universe, and power took new forms. War became sacred, captives became offerings, blood became a doorway between worlds. Not brutality, not cruelty, not senseless violence, but cosmology, because the Maya believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to set creation in motion, and so rulers, children of gods, were expected to echo that sacrifice. Bloodletting was their duty, their dialogue with the divine, their offering to the invisible forces that held the world together. Imagine a king standing at dawn on the steps of his temple, a stingray spine in his hand, a crowd silent beneath him. He draws the spine across his skin, a thin line of blood falling on bark paper. He burns it. The smoke rises, and in that smoke, they believe, the ancestors arrive. For the people, this was proof that their king was not merely a ruler. He was a bridge, a conduit, a living axis between the mortal and the divine, and around such kings, cities transformed. Temples grew taller, plazas grew broader, courts became stages for political theatre. Alliances formed, friendships shattered, wars ignited with a single glyph. Dynasties took shape, long lines of rulers stretching across centuries, names repeating like echoes. Yaks Ebe Shok, Chak Tok Ichak, Yuknum Chin, Kinihyana Apakal, families whose blood carried legitimacy like a sacred flame. And these dynasties did not exist alone. They formed webs, networks of marriage, tribute, political maneuvering, and ritual obligation. Tikal and Kalakmul watched each other like twin predators. Gopan and Quirigua shifted between alliance and rebellion. Karakol rose from obscurity to defeat giants. The Maya world became a tapestry of power, a tapestry woven not with swords or spears, but with glyphs, astronomy, marriage alliances, and the sacred logic of kingship. Every city was a kingdom, every kingdom a universe, every universe ruled by a monarch whose body held the cosmos. But even grandeur casts a shadow, and beneath the triumph of kings, beneath the blazing murals, beneath the towering temples, a tension began to grow. How long could the land support such ambition? How long could the people farm under the weight of royal demands? How long could the heavens sustain a political order built so completely on the alignment between cosmos and crown? The Maya did not yet know. The classic period was only beginning. A sunrise, still soft, on the horizon, and ahead lay brilliance, cities that reached unimaginable heights, art that still stuns the modern eye, mathematics so precise that even today it borders on the uncanny, but also ahead, darkness, strain, splintering, a slow unravelling of the world, the divine kings, built with such delicate balance. But that is not for now. Now we stand in the radiance of their rise, in the moment when myth and leadership combined to create something no other civilization matched. And yet, even within this radiance, this golden dawn of sacred kingship, another force quietly awakened, not a rival, not an enemy, not a conqueror, approaching from beyond, a force much closer, much older, much more patient, time, because time was the one element the Maya understood better than anyone. They measured it, they mapped it, they carved it into monuments as easily as others carved stone. But time does not bend forever to the will of kings, even divine kings. And as these rulers carved their claims into stelae and temple walls, glyph by glyph, cycle by cycle, the demands of kingship grew heavier. To rule meant to perform. To perform meant to sacrifice. To sacrifice meant to sustain the bond between heaven and earth. And that bond was fragile. The people believed their kings were cosmic beings, anchors holding the world in balance. But the kings were human, and humans grow tired. Still, the classic kings did not falter, not yet. They carried their sacred burdens with unwavering resolve. They bled for the gods. They married for alliances. They built for eternity. They waged war with ritual purpose. They planted their legacies into the very soil of the Maya world. In this age, cities did not simply thrive. They competed, not for land, not for gold, for meaning, for cosmic legitimacy, for alignment with myth and power and prophecy. Tikal raised monuments like living giants. Kalakmul answered with temples that scraped the sky. Kopan crafted artistry so intricate that modern scholars still marvel at its precision. Palenque built palaces that shimmered with watery metaphors, a kingdom of philosophers and astronomer kings. Every city sang its own song. Every city crafted its own identity. Every city claimed its lineage from myth, and in the centre of each city's world stood the king, a living axis mundi, a cosmic pillar in human form. From his palace, he spoke to the ancestors. From his throne, he commanded the seasons. From his rituals, he ensured the sun would rise again. It was a burden no mortal could carry alone. So kings surrounded themselves with courts, scribes, astronomers, war captains, ritualists, each one a guardian of a fragment of cosmic order. Together, they wove a world breathed into being by ceremony that began before dawn, when the first star still glimmered in the east. Ceremony that ended long after midnight, when the king sat alone before a basin of water, seeking visions in its stillness, ceremony that echoed through plazas, crowded with thousands, all waiting for one gesture, the moment when the king pierced the veil between realms and summoned the divine. These rituals were not performance, they were necessity, for the Maya believed that the universe could unravel if kings failed in their duties, and that belief forged loyalty as strong as stone. But loyalty carries expectation. Expectation carries pressure. Pressure carries consequences. And consequences, in the classic Maya world, were written in the language of war. War was ritual. War was theatre. War was a sacred dialogue between kings. Victories confirmed cosmic favour. Defeats threatened cosmic collapse. To capture a rival king was not political triumph. It was divine proof. Proof that the gods favoured one lineage over another. Proof that destiny had shifted. Proof that power had realigned in the eternal cycles of time. Some captives were sacrificed, offered as cosmic payment. Others were displayed in stelae, carved with painful honesty. A king on his knees, hands bound, head bowed. A reminder that even rulers of divine blood were not immune to the tides of fate. But war did not define the Maya world. It shaped it. Cities rose and fell in these sacred conflicts, their fortunes changing like constellations that brighten and dim across centuries. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: the belief that kingship was not a privilege, but a cosmic burden. Kings were not tyrants. They were caretakers, guardians of balance, stewards of time, and their people looked to them for everything. Rain, harvest, victory, divine favor. So long as kings fulfilled their duties, so long as rituals remained exact, so long as the cosmos is felt aligned, the world thrived and thrive. It did. Under the classic kings, the Maya reached heights that astonish. Modern understanding, mathematics grew elegant. Calendars became masterpieces of cyclical thinking. Astronomy reached precision that modern scientists still analyze with awe. The Maya predicted eclipses, tracked Venus cycles with perfect accuracy, mapped the movements of the heavens as though reading the mind of the cosmos. This was not coincidence, it was devotion, a devotion that transformed cities into sanctuaries of knowledge, libraries of stone, universities carved in plazas, observatories rising above treetops, every temple a classroom, every stairway a teaching, every glyph a window into the structure of reality. But greatness always casts two shadows. The first is pride. The second is fragility, because a world built so delicately on cosmic order cannot survive if that order begins to falter. And faltering it was. Slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, rain patterns shifted, crops struggled, populations grew beyond the land's limits. Ritual demands became heavier, wars more frequent, dynasties more desperate to maintain favour from gods who seemed increasingly distant. The classic Maya stood at the zenith of their power, but the zenith is a moment of balance, and balance never lasts. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, we remain in the brilliance of this age, when kings carved their names into eternity, when cities glowed like stars upon the earth, and when the Maya stood closer to the cosmos than any civilization, before or after. For a long time, the divine kings held their thrones as bridges between worlds, but in the centuries that followed, something even greater began to rise. A mind, a voice, a brilliance, so sharp that even time could not dull it. The Maya, farmers once, wanderers once, survivors once, stepped into an age of breathtaking genius, not slowly, not timidly, but with the force of a civilization that finally understood its own potential. Cities no longer whispered. They sang, palenque, sang in stone, carving poetry into every wall of its water-bright palaces. Tikal sang in height, lifting temples, so tall they pierced the mist like obsidian blades, aimed at heaven. Kalakmul sang in power, its kings casting shadows over hundreds of miles of jungle kingdoms. Kopan sang in glyphs, its scribes writing history with artistry so intricate scholars still tremble while reading it. Uxmal sang in geometry, its walls curving and lifting like frozen music, and through all of it, the Maya mind expanded. Astronomy became scripture, mathematics became architecture, writing became memory, carved in surfaces that refused to forget. Look deeper, you will see it. The Maya were not simply observers of the sky. They were its interpreters, its translators, its partners. Night after night, priests climbed their temple stairs, waiting in silence. For the moment, the universe revealed another secret. Venus gliding across the dawn, Jupiter rising in steady fire, eclipses unfolding like cosmic curtains, the Pleiades tightening and loosening their cluster. The Maya watched it all and wrote it all. Their numbers had rhythm, their equations had soul, their symbols had breath. Zero, that strange, dangerous idea that other civilizations feared to touch, the Maya embraced, as though it were an old friend. Zero, to mark beginnings. Zero, to mark endings. Zero, to measure cycles that spun far longer than human lives. And with that zero, their calendars reached precision that modern astronomers still admire. Every cycle nested within another. Every date woven through a web of cosmic meaning. Every ceremony timed to the distant pulse of the heavens. The classic Maya did not simply track time. They spoke it, held it, shaped it. But brilliance was not only written in numbers, it was chiseled into stone. Stelae rose like forest trees, tall, slender, alive, with dynastic memory. Each one a portrait, a proclamation, a story told in glyphs that twist and unfold like vines of knowledge. Kings stood tall on these monuments, their garments woven with jade, their staffs bearing the heads of gods. Some monuments show kings standing triumphant, others kneeling in bloodletting, opening portals between realms with their own pain. Some monuments show captives, broken, bound, their fate sealed in stone. Because this age was not gentle, brilliance and brutality often walk the same path. The Maya understood this. They did not turn away. They carved truth as it was, not softened, not censored. War was sacred. Our feuds were cosmic. victories were divine messages, and at the center of those wars stood two giants, Tikal and Calakmul, two kingdoms so powerful their conflict shaped centuries. Their rivalry was not one story, it was dozens, hundreds, a tangle of battles, alliances, betrayals, and cosmic claims. Sometimes Tikal ruled, sometimes Calakmul rose, sometimes both fell into silence, while lesser cities carried the flame of ambition forward. But rivalry was only one thread. Elsewhere, art bloomed. Palenque crafted poots with chisels. Its kings, especially Pakal the Great, built tombs so beautiful they glowed with myth. Inside his sarcophagus lid, Pakal is carved as the maize god, falling, ascending, reborn, cyclical as the seasons. It is not merely art, it is theology, a story told in stone to teach the living that death is not an end, but a doorway. And Copan, oh Copan, wrote its story on an entire staircase, 63 steps, 3,000 glyphs, a river of words flowing upward into the sky. The longest Maya text ever carved, a monument not to a king, but to memory itself. This was the height of Maya brilliance. Mathematicians counted centuries as though counting seeds. Architects mapped the sky onto the earth with terrifying precision. Scribes carried entire worlds inside their hands. Artists turned stone into breath. Priests turned time into music. Kings turned myth into history. The world they built was not merely advanced, it was alive, and in this living world, every temple was the body of a god, every city the reflection of the cosmos, every ceremony our conversation between mortals and the divine. But beneath all this glory, if you listen carefully, you can hear something faint, a crack, a soft strain beneath the weight of brilliance, because brilliance, too great, begins to burn, and fire, even the fire of genius, has a cost. The classic Maya were shining at their brightest, and in the universe things shine brightest just before they begin to fall. But that moment has not arrived yet. For now, we stand in the full radiance of Maya greatness in the era where cities were galaxies, kings were cosmic, and knowledge was the closest thing to divinity. And yet, even in this brilliance, the Maya were not finished. For genius is not a destination. It is a hunger, a soft, eternal ache to understand a little more than the day before. And the classic Maya hungered for understanding of the earth, of the sky, of themselves. And so they built places where knowledge could live, observatories standing above the forest like stone crowns, open to the wind, open to the sun, open to the long breaths of the universe. In these observatories, priests watched the turning of the heavens. They recorded every shift, every alignment, every whisper of the wandering stars. And as they observed, patterns emerged, patterns within patterns, cycles within cycles, a cosmic rhythm so delicate, so intricate, that only a mind attuned to silence could feel it. The Maya felt it, and once felt, they dedicated their entire lives to understanding it. Look closely, you can see the way their buildings repeat, the motions of the sky, a temple facing east to greet the sun on the equinox, a window framing Venus, on the morning when its brilliance returns after months of disappearance. A courtyard measuring shadows so that solstices can be read in the length of light. These are not accidents. These are not guesses. They are precision, carved into limestone, set into plazas, buried beneath layers of paint and ceremony. Precision born from devotion. Devotion born from awe. But knowledge is not only a tool, it is a mirror. And when a civilization learns too much about the heavens, it begins to understand itself. The Maya saw in the sky what they saw in their own world. Cycles of creation, destruction, rebirth. Empires rose like Venus. At dawn, empires fell like Venus into the underworld of night. Seasons turned, generations changed. Cities flourished, then withered, then rose again, reborn under new kings, new names, new visions. Time was not a line, it was a circle, a great, breathing circle that wrapped everything, stone, bone, blood, memory, into one endless story. And because the Maya saw their world as cycles, they recorded history in cycles, not to measure human lives, but to measure the lives of worlds. Every inscription, a heartbeat, every calendar, a prophecy, every monument, a conversation with the endlessness of time. And yet, they did not hoard this knowledge. They taught it. Across the Maya lands, schools emerged in temples, quiet rooms, where young scribes learned to carve signs into soft bark paper using reed pens. They practiced over and over. The curve of a serpent, the teeth of a jaguar, the swirl of the cosmic wind. A scribe was not a writer. A scribe was a vessel for memory, a vessel for time, a vessel for truths too deep for ordinary voices. Some scribes devoted themselves to mathematics. They memorized multiples of 20, the base of the Maya system. They learned the movement of numbers as though counting the breaths of gods. Others devoted themselves to astronomy. They tracked the lunar cycles with stunning precision. They mapped the solar year with margins so small it astonishes modern science. Others still devoted their lives to myth. They memorized epics, performed them in rituals, taught them to children who would one day to repeat the cycle in their own voices. And throughout this world of stone minds and skybound thought, art bloomed like tropical flowers after rain, not decorative, not ornamental. Art as knowledge, art as memory, art as divine expression. Look at the murals of Bonampak, their colours still breathing after 1,000 years. Warriors marching in rows, musicians drumming the pulse of ceremony, captives standing in resignation, nobles wrapped in jade and feathered crowns. Every stroke a world, every colour a truth. Look at the masks of Ekbalam, I, Jaguar yours, open wide as though swallowing the living world. Look at the friezes of Kohunlik, giant eyes staring out from beneath, stucco headdresses heavy with symbolism. Look at the carved lintels of Yakshalan, queens pulling thorns through their tongues to summon ancestors from the other world. These are not images. They are gateways. Gateways to belief. Gateways to myth. Gateways to the unseen. And through these gateways, knowledge flowed. The Maya were not isolated. They traded with the Gulf Coast, the highlands, the Pacific slopes, obsidian from Mexico, jade from Guatemala, salt from Yucatan, cacao from the tropical south. Ideas travelled with them, techniques, secrets, stories. In this age, the Maya world was not a map of separate cities. It was a network, a breathing network of kingdoms, each one linked by trade, ritual, marriage, astronomy, and a shared cosmic vision, a vision of cycles, a vision of order, a vision of the gods dwelling not above, but within the trees, within the stones, within the rivers, within the people, and at the centre of this vision stood the kings. But kings were not alone. Queens held power too. Some queens ruled as regents, some as co-rulers, some, like Lady Six Sky and Lady Yol Iknal, led armies, built monuments, and revived dynasties. From the edge of oblivion, the Maya world was not simply a world of kings, it was a world of dynasties. And dynasties were alive. They spoke through their monuments. They persisted through their blood. They carried the memory of cities across centuries. But in the shadows of this brilliance, pressure grew. Populations swelled beyond what the land could bear. Forests were cut too quickly. Fields exhausted too deeply. Rivalries grew hotter. Trade routes shifted like the courses of ancient rivers. Cities watched each other with unease. Alliances became fragile. Wars became frequent. Ceremonial obligations became heavy burdens on the people who supported them. The Maya had built a world of staggering beauty, complexity, and intelligence, but the weight of that world began to tremble. A crack in a reservoir wall, a drought that lasted one season too long, a crop failure that sent fear through farmers across the lowlands, and beneath it all, a quiet question began to echo in the hearts of the people. What happens if the kings can no longer speak to the gods? What happens if the cycles stop aligning? What happens if the cosmos changes its rhythm? These questions did not yet shatter cities. Not yet, but they whispered, softly, persistently, dangerously. The classic period still shone with full brilliance, but the brilliance carried shadows, and those shadows were growing. But that belongs to the next chapter. For now, in the glow of Maya genius, a world of astronomy, mathematics, art, architecture, dynasties, and divinity. A world that touched the sky, not with arrogance, but with reverent awe. For a long time, the Maya world burned bright, a constellation of genius and ceremony and cosmic order. But brilliance carries weight, and weight, if held too long, begins to tremble. And one day, the trembling did not fade. It deepened, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but quietly, like a hairline fracture, is hidden beneath a polished surface, a whisper beneath the roar of greatness, a soft warning beneath centuries of triumph. Something was shifting, something the Maya could feel before they could name. It began with the sky. The rains grew inconsistent, not missing, just hesitant, arriving late, leaving early, pausing for reasons no priest could explain. Reservoirs dropped lower than before. Fields cracked beneath the heat. Forests dried at their edges. It was not a catastrophe. It was an imbalance, a small one, a quiet one. But quiet imbalances become loud consequences. At first, the kings responded as they always had, with ritual, with offering, with ceremony. They opened their skin to the gods. They burned their blood to the ancestors. They prayed in plazas where thousands held their breath as smoke rose into the sky. And sometimes the rains returned, but not always, not enough, and doubt, that dangerous seed, rooted itself in the hearts of the people. Meanwhile, something else was stirring. Cities were growing, too large, too fast. Populations swelled to sizes no previous generation had imagined. More mouths to feed, more fields to plant, more water to gather, more pressure on a land that could only give so much. Farmers walked farther each year. Forests fell deeper with every cycle. The soil weakened, the yields dropped, and beneath the grandeur of royal courts, the everyday people, farmers, labourers, craftsmen, felt the strain. First, their work fed the cities. Their hands built the temples. Their backs held the weight of divine kingship. And when the rains failed, or the soil thinned, or the rivers ran low, their world tightened. But drought was not alone. Politics shifted too. For centuries, cities had balanced alliances and rivalries, like dancers in an endless ceremonial cycle. But that balance began to wobble. Old enemies awoke, new ambitions rose, dynasties fought for dominance in wars, both sacred and strategic. Tikal and Kalakmul resumed their ancient rivalry, but now the stakes were heavier. Victories meant survival, defeats meant collapse, and as cities clashed, trade routes faltered, goods became scarce, obsidian travelled slower, jade grew expensive, salt became precious. A civilization interwoven through trade felt each break like a wound, and still the people looked to their kings. But kings were struggling for the first time in centuries. Their rituals did not guarantee rain. Their sacrifices did not guarantee victory. Their cosmic authority began to blur. If the rain did not return, was it the king's fault? If the crops failed, had he lost favour with the gods? If war brought defeat, was he still the chosen conduit between realms? Questions, once unthinkable, now whispered through villages and markets and plazas, and whispers in great numbers become winds as pressure built. Many cities began to fracture from within. Councils challenged kings. Nobles challenged councils. Factions challenged each other. Power, which once flowed smoothly from ruler to people, now split and splintered along unseen lines. Some cities turned inward, closed their gates, hoarded resources, prepared for drought or war, or both. Others tried to rise above the chaos, tried to restore the old balance, tried to rebuild the cosmic order that had made them great. But the cosmos felt distant, and distance breeds fear. And in that fear, abandonment began, quiet at first. A few families leaving for better fields. A few farmers seeking water in distant valleys. A few villages choosing to move their hearths rather than stay in parched land. But soon the few became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Entire districts fell silent. Homes still standing, but unused, as though the people had simply walked out one day and never returned. Archaeologists find these places now, bowls still on floors, metates still leaning, unfinished carvings, abandoned midline, signs not of war but of departure, a census of absence, cities that once thrived with tens of thousands began to hollow. Their temples still rose into the sky. Their plazas still waited for ceremonies that would never again be held. The kings still performed rituals, but for smaller crowds, quieter crowds filled with worry, because the people had begun to understand a truth no one dared speak. A city is only as strong as the world that sustains it, and their world was unraveling. But this was not the end. Not yet. The collapse was not a fall, but a long, slow unthreading of the fabric that once held the Maya world together. City by city, thread by thread, the connections weakened. Some places fell quickly, others held on for centuries. Some briefly rose, again a final flame. Before dusk, the unraveling was not one event, it was dozens, hundreds, a cascade of pressures, combining into a weight too heavy for even this brilliant civilization to carry. But even in collapse, beauty remained. Art never stopped. Glyphs were still carved. Temples were still painted. Rulers still reached for the sacred. There was dignity in their endurance, grace in their refusal to surrender to despair. Even as cities fell silent, the Maya spirit did not die. It shifted, moved, transformed. The great lowland kingdoms were fading, but other regions were rising. The Maya highlands, the Puke Hills, the northern Yucatan, places that would one day birth new centers, new rulers, new visions. But that is a story for another time. And as the great centers dimmed, something even quieter began to take shape. A shift, not of stone, not of blood, but of belief. For centuries, the Maya had trusted that the cosmos was steady, that the cycles would always align, that rituals would always work, that kings would always hear the voice of the divine. But now, the alignments grew strange. The rituals felt thin. The voices faded into silence. And when a civilization built on cosmic certainty feels the cosmos turn uncertain, fear spreads. Like smoke in the night, priests searched the skies for answers. Astronomers checked their calculations. Scribes wrote prophecies into bark paper with trembling hands. But the answers did not come. And when answers do not come, people turn to their own survival. Some cities tightened their ritual schedules, performing more sacrifices, calling louder to the gods, trying desperately to coax the universe back into alignment. Others shifted their ceremonies to new gods, new symbols, new interpretations of fate. Some abandoned the old temples entirely and built new shrines closer to the forests, as though the wild, the ancient, the untouched might hear them better. But in all this motion, one truth grew clear. A civilization built on balance was losing its balance, and losing balance makes even the strong tremble. The roads that once carried traders and pilgrims grew overgrown. Sakbiub, that once glowed white, beneath moonlight, cracked and crumbled. Under vines, the great plazas, where crowds, once gathered for festivals, fell silent. Footprints faded, wind replaced voices, leaves replaced drums, and the cities, those magnificent, cosmic theatres of stone, stood tall, but hollow, like shells left behind by a retreating tide. Imagine walking there in those final years. Temples still soar into the sky, but the paint is peeling, the plaster is cracked, the stairways echo only with the rustle of leaves. Markets are half empty, workshops no longer ring with the sound of chisels. Children play in streets where vendors once sold obsidian, cacao, salt, shells. Life is still present, but dimmer, quieter, as though the cities are breathing their last, long breath. In some places, the end came like a whisper, a meeting here, a conversation there, and suddenly, our decision that had never been imaginable. We must leave, not because of war, not because of fire, not because of plague, but because the land could no longer carry them. Families gathered what they could, grinding stones, pots, blades, a few precious carvings of gods. Some carried seeds, some carried memories, some carried grief. They walked away from cities their ancestors had built, stone by stone, generation by generation, walked away from temples that had once been the center of their world, walked away from history itself, and the cities, those ancient, proud, majestic cities, watched them go. For the first time in centuries, the plazas stood empty. For the first time, the temples heard no chants, no drums, no prayers. For the first time, the cosmic order felt untethered. Some kings refused to surrender. They reinforced walls, rebuilt reservoirs, begged neighbouring cities for alliances. Some even attempted to relocate their courts, moving the royal lineage to hills, to safer valleys, to places less threatened by drought and conflict. But power cannot survive without people, and people cannot survive without land. The unravelling was slow but absolute, and yet, even as the great lowlands grew silent, the Maya themselves did not vanish. They moved northward, southward, into the highlands where the mountains held water longer, into the Puuc Hills where new cities like Uxmal would rise with astonishing brilliance, into the Yucatan where Chichen Itza would one day shine like a second sun. The Maya did not die. They migrated, transformed, adapted, just as their ancestors once transformed from wanderers into farmers, and from farmers into builders, and from builders into astronomers, and from astronomers into kings. Change was not new to them. What was new, what was heartbreaking, was the loss of the old heartlands, the great jungles that once held El Mirador, Tikal, Calakmul, and dozens of other kingdoms, became graveyards, not of bones, but of silence. The collapse was not quick. It lasted decades, centuries. Different cities fell at different times, each one a spark snuffed out in slow motion. And yet, even here, in the fading, there was beauty. Some cities held farewell ceremonies, final rituals to honour the land they were leaving, final dances for gods who had protected them for centuries, final songs for ancestors whose stones would soon be swallowed by vines. Imagine that, a civilization so devoted that even in collapse, even in sorrow, they said goodbye with reverence. There is grace in that kind of ending, a quiet grace, a dignified grace, a grace like the soft closing of a long-loved book. The world remembers the collapse as disappearance. But disappearance is not the truth. The truth is movement. The Maya did not fall. They shifted. They carried their rituals, their languages, their calendars, their stories, their gods, all of it, into new lands, new eras, new generations. They built anew. They dreamed anew. They survived in ways that still echo, in bloodlines, across Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, Honduras, and beyond. And in the silent cities they left behind, the jungle returned, roots pushed through plazas, vines crept across carved masks, trees grew from rooftops, where kings once stood. Nature did not destroy the Maya world. It cradled it, wrapped it in green arms, protected it in layers of shadow and soil, held it like a memory too important to forget. And because of that, when the world one day returned to those ruins, the ruins were still there, waiting, breathing, enduring, a reminder that civilizations do not vanish. They change shape, they relocate, they transform, they leave echoes for the future to uncover. For a long time, after the great lowland kingdoms faded into silence and the jungle folded their memories into green shadow, the Maya world did not end. It shifted. Families who once lived beneath towering temples now travelled north toward hills where the earth held water differently, toward plains where the rains were kinder, toward limestone lands where rivers ran beneath the ground like hidden veins of the world. The Yucatan waited for them, dry on the surface, wet underneath, filled with caves, cenotes, and caverns that felt like gateways to the underworld. To the Maya, they were not merely wells. They were entrances, thresholds, sacred openings into the realm of ancestors. And around these waters, life grew again. New villages took root where none had stood before. New markets hummed with voices from distant regions. New ceremonies rose toward skies that felt unfamiliar, but welcoming. Slowly, the migrants became residents, and residents became builders, and builders became dreamers. Once more, cities began to rise again, not from the ashes, but from the footsteps of those who refused to let their story end. Uxmal, Sayil, Kabar, Labna, and above them all, a name that would one day echo through centuries. Chichen Itza. It did not begin as a miracle. Few things do. It began as a gathering place, a crossroads, a sanctuary near sacred waters. But something in the land sparked ambition. Something in the people sparked remembrance. Slowly, stones lifted, platforms widened, walls rose, and the new Maya, children of migrants, heirs of survivors, began to weave old wisdom into new forms. The Puuk Hills bloomed with architecture so precise, so elegant, so impossibly detailed that even the gods must have paused to watch geometric facades cut from limestone like lace, serpent columns curling down stairways, masks of rain gods stacked in patterns that seemed to breathe. When the sun shifted, these cities did not look like the old ones. They were lighter, sharper, more deliberate, a different kind of beauty. And yet, beneath the differences, something familiar pulsed. The Maya mind, the mind that mapped stars, that counted centuries, that carved stories into stone, that saw time, not as a line, but as a circle. In these new centres, the old knowledge was not lost. It was reborn. Astronomers still climbed heights to greet Venus at dawn. Priests still bled to open pathways between worlds. Scribes still painted codices in folds of bark paper, delicate as breath. And in this rebirth, a new brilliance rose. Chichen Itza became a beacon, pulling pilgrims from every direction, pulling ideas from every horizon. Its temples did not mimic the pre-classic world. They transcended it. The pyramid of Kukulkan, its steps aligned to summon a serpent of shadow during equinox, stood like a riddle posed to the sky. The great ball court, vast as an arena of gods, carried echoes of shouts and ritual, of victory and sacrifice, of players whose movements were prayers. The observatory, rounded like a star house, turned its windows to the heavens, as though listening for the whisper of planets. Every structure spoke two languages, one of stone, one of sky, and the Maya listened to both. But this new age was not shaped only by the Maya. Winds from central Mexico carried new ideas, new symbols, new deities, new ways of weaving power. Toltec influence flowed into Chichen Itza like a tide, not conquering, not erasing, but blending. Feathered serpents coiled across balustrades. Eagles and jaguars appeared in reliefs with fierce clarity. Warrior columns rose as though holding the sky itself. This fusion did not weaken the Maya world. It expanded it. A hybrid civilization was forming, a tapestry woven from two traditions that recognized something kindred in each other's myths. From this fusion came dynamism. Trade reached farther. Influence grew stronger. Power shifted from kingdom to league, from singular kings to councils, from dynasties to orders of elites. The political shape of the Maya world was changing. Gone was the absolute rule of divine kings. In its place, collective governance, shared authority, assemblies that debated the rhythm of life. The Maya had learned from collapse. They adapted their politics as they had adapted to drought, war, migration. A civilization that survives is a civilization that transforms. And yet, even as Chichen Itza rose in majesty, even as Uxmal glittered with artistry, even as new cities cut new paths through the hills, the echoes of the old world were never lost. Every glyph held memory, every ceremony held lineage, every stone held the breath of ancestors whose cities now slept under vines, because the Maya did not break the thread of their past. They carried it through collapse, through migration, through rebirth, through renewal, and that thread still exists in the woven high piles of highland women, in the prayers spoken at cenotes, in the stories told by elders beneath starlit nights, in the faces of millions who still walk ancestral lands. The Maya did not vanish. They never vanished. Their civilization transformed, as all great civilizations do, but their people endured. The old cities became ruins. The ruins became memories. The memories became roots. And the roots still feed lives and languages and culture to this very day. If you listen closely, in the hush of night, in the breath before sleep, you can still hear it, the heartbeat of a world that refused to die, a world that rose and fell and rose again, a world that still whispers. Through forests, through stones, through time. A world waiting for those who are willing to listen. When you're ready, we can walk deeper still into the afterlives of empires, into the long memory of the Maya, into the quiet truth that no civilization ends. It only changes shape. For a long time, after Chichen Itza cast its long shadow across the northern plains, the Maya world entered a new rhythm. Not decline, not rise, but transformation. The land was changing again. The people were changing again. And change, for the Maya, was never the end. It was simply another doorway. In the villages, scattered across Yucatan, farmers planted maize, as their ancestors had, kneeling, singing, pressing seeds into warm soil that remembered every generation. Children learned the old stories beside hearths that glowed in the blue hours before dawn. Stories of gods born in darkness, of heroes raised from maize, of worlds created and destroyed until balance was found, and elders watched the sky with quiet certainty, reading patterns their great-grandparents had memorized. From the breath of stars, life continued, not as repetition, but as echo, a steady beat, beneath shifting times. Yet even as the old ways lived, new forces moved. Across the peninsula, caravans arrived, from forest roads, worn smooth by generations of trade. Canoes glided through coastal waters, bright as polished jade. Foreign merchants stood in marketplaces, beneath the shade of ceiba trees, their accents, strange, but their goods, familiar. The Maya absorbed everything, blended everything, transformed everything. Ideas travelled as easily as obsidian blades. Beliefs shifted like constellations. Styles of dress, architecture, ritual, politics, all of it flowed between regions like rivers without banks. And through this flow, new powers rose. Mayapan took shape in the northern plains, a walled city, compact, strategic, watchful. Its rulers built councils instead of dynasties, laws instead of bloodlines, assemblies instead of divine decree. A different kind of governance, a different kind of order. Inside its walls, families from dozens of lineages lived together, discussing plans, sharing authority, balancing power, as though it were a fragile flame. Outside its walls, other cities found their place. In the new web, Izamal, with its temples, glowing gold. Beneath the sun, money with old traditions, woven into every ceremony. Tulum, clinging to cliffs, like a sentinel watching the Caribbean. Cobar, its ancient roads, still stretching miles through thick forest, like memories that refused to die. Together, they formed a mosaic, each tile different, each one necessary. The Maya world was no longer a kingdom of kings. It was a constellation of communities, bound by trade, ritual, shared season, shared story, and the quiet pulse of an identity, older than any city. And still, beneath all this motion, something more was happening, a deeper resilience, a deeper wisdom. The Maya had learned from catastrophe. They understood the fragility of water, soil, forest. They respected what had once burned them. Fields were rotated. Forests were managed. Water was honored as sacred memory. Even today, archaeologists find no ruins of recklessness. In this era, only evidence of a people who adapted again and again and again. But the world around them was not so gentle. Far across the sea, nations stirred, empires sharpened, ships with wooden ribs and white sails cut through oceans no Maya had ever seen. And though the Maya did not know it yet, those sails were drifting closer. The world was narrowing. Distances were shrinking. The quiet peninsulas of Yucatan lay in the path of a storm. No ritual could turn away. Still, in the years before the storm came, the Maya lived with the fullness of their reborn world. Markets bustled, ceremonies echoed, scribes painted codices with hands that remembered ancient calligraphy. Astronomers aligned temples to solstices with a precision that still astonishes modern scholars. And every night the stars returned. They always returned. In their glow, the Maya found comfort, direction, identity. Time was not marching forward as the rest of the world believed. Time was circling, breathing, unfolding in patterns that mirrored the opening of a flower. Even as foreign winds drew nearer, the Maya felt no ending, only continuation, because a civilization is not stone, it is memory, it is language, it is the way a grandmother teaches her granddaughter to weave. It is the way a father teaches his son to read clouds for rain. It is the way stories move from voice to voice until the story itself becomes a living thing. And such things do not disappear, not with drought, not with war, not with collapse, not with conquest. The Maya were more than cities, more than kings, more than monuments. They were and are a people of time. Time was their teacher, their canvas, their compass, their companion. So when outsiders came with armor and hunger and maps that carved the world into possessions, the Maya world did not vanish. It simply shifted again. Families hid their sacred bundles. Priests whispered their ceremonies in forests. Communities preserved their language beneath the weight of new rule. Farmers tilled fields with the same prayers their ancestors once sang beneath pre-classic suns, and the thread continued, a thread so thin it seemed breakable, yet so strong it has outlasted cities, empires, nations, and centuries. Today, that thread still hums beneath the surface of modern life. In words spoken in Quiche, Yucatec, Kaqchikel, Mam, in textiles bright as dawn, in dance older than memory, in hands that carve jade with ancient respect, in prayers spoken to winds that still know the names of the first gods. The Maya did not end. They endured, they adapted, they transformed, they survived, and if you close your eyes, you can almost hear them, not as ruins, not as echoes, but as breath, as footsteps, as voices, still carried by the jungle. The story has not finished. It never will, because civilizations do not die. They scatter, they seed, they root themselves in new soil. They rise in new forms. They live through those who remember, and the Maya remember, across forests, across cities, across time itself. They remember. If you listen, you can remember too. Just breathe. Just rest. The story is still unfolding, and you are now part of its quiet path through the night.